this ongoing story which led to his being expelled from the Labour Party on anti-Semitism. Mélenchon was the only European leader on the left to say publicly that Corbyn had caved in, that it was a big mistake, that he had caved into the Jewish lobby, using expressions like this. We're heading toward, a major political catastrophe, possibly in the future.
So, Professor Philippe, thank you for being here. I'd like to say, I first came across yourself when reading a Financial Times article about Jean-Luc Mélenchon and about exactly trying to understand and get to grips with what's going on in France right now. So, in your view, what do you make of the current blockade that's happening in Parliament, and as a consequence of protests that have happened over the past day? So it's called Block Everything, and yeah.
Okay, thanks for having me, Alex, to start with. Well, I think what we're seeing currently in France, the turmoil, the shambolic state of French politics, I think, is the consequence of President Macron's snap election last year. Until last year, Macron, back in 2022, had been re-elected president for a second term, and he won consequently a general election without an absolute majority, but he won it. His party was still the main party in parliament. Following a poor result at the EU election over a year ago, he decided to dissolve the National Assembly and call a snap election, taking everyone by surprise. So we know the outcome. His party lost ground. It is no longer the main party in parliament. And now you've got three main blocs. Mm-hmm. None of them is near an absolute majority, and none of them can work with another bloc. It's not easy. You've got a left-wing bloc, you've got Macron's centre-right bloc, and you've got essentially the National Rally and far-right bloc, and squeeze in the middle, sometimes leaning toward Macron, sometimes not. You've got what's left of formerly the main Conservative Party, Les Républicains. Mm-hmm. So it's a funny situation. And of course, it brings about instability because any government since last year hasn't been able really to form a long-lasting government. There are also other issues. If you think of the outgoing Prime Minister François Bayrou, he was appointed with the reputation of being someone who could turn both to the left and to the right, negotiate and make deals with both parts, But that's what you need when no one has a majority. He didn't do that at all. He, in fact, leaned like his predecessors to the right. And what was the fatal blow was his budget bill, mm-hmm. Which with severe cuts in public spendings, with a view to reducing public debt, which is very high, historic high at the moment. But of course, that wasn't seen as fair because the burden was put on middle classes and working class people, as opposed, for instance, of other solutions. The left, for instance, was advocating a tax on the very wealthy. There's a French economist called Gabriel Zucman, and he's come up with, taxing 2% on the people who have, the 1% of the wealthy, over 100,000 billion, very, very rich. That concerns, just a few thousand people. The right always objected to it. So that's why Bayrou lost, and that's why we've got this situation. I'll also make a point about the choice of Macron. Sébastien Lecornu, not a household name mm-hmm. in the UK, not even one in France, by the way. He's been in government since 2017. In every government since Macron was elected, he's been there. That shows one thing: is is a loyal man to Macron. That's what it shows. He was lately a defense minister. He's very young, 39. Nothing wrong about that. Macron was also 39 when he was first elected. I think the problem is that his background. He comes from Les Républicains initially. He followed Macron early on in 2017, so he was expelled from Les Républicains. And on socioeconomic matters, but also on cultural matters, very conservative. So that doesn't augur well for the next sequence, because I suppose it's really the last chance for Macron before the end of his term in 1.5 years. He can't afford to lose yet another prime minister. We've had already 5 since 2022. That's a record number. If Le Cornu does more of the same and carries on, trying to impose very unpopular economic policies, notably tries to do what Bayrou failed to do, I suppose that he will not last long in government. So this is where we are now. But again, it is very striking that Macron should have made that choice of Le Cornu, which sends a very clear signal. It is, we're not going to open up to the centre left.
You mentioned the left there, trying to, or the new prime minister who will struggle to find coalition with the left. As far as the left goes, as you mentioned earlier, it's made up of a number of parties. How would you distinguish between, say, voters of the LFE, voters of the Socialists, voters of the Communists, and voters of the Greens? How do they differ from each other, and why is it that there's been so much infighting and that now they've not been able to really grab hold of that coalition?
Yeah, that's a good question, because one of the worrying signs is that the left has been in a position since 2017. Until 2017, there was a socialist president, François Hollande, who did not run again. Since then, the left has really been at a historic low in electoral terms and hasn't regained the momentum, hasn't regained even more votes or more support in the polls. In each election, we see that the only political party in France which has political momentum is the National Rally, the far right. So that's a very worrying thing, is that you have been in a position for 8 years, which is a very long time in politics, and there's still, roughly speaking, when you put together all the votes, left-wing votes, it's hardly 30%. So that's really extremely low. In the past, very defeated left would at least get altogether 42%, so 30%, and they've been stuck there since 2017. So yeah, there is infighting. Just another point, there's always been historically infighting on the French left, and that's a very big difference with the British situation, where you have Broadchurch, called the Labour Party, which has always been able, more or less well, to accommodate people, people like John McDonnell, before Jeremy Corbyn, to very centrist people. In France, you have an offer, you have a choice between, to simplify at the moment, the so-called New Popular Front, that was the name given to the electoral coalition in 2024, 4 parties in there. 2 historic parties, Socialist Party, Communist Party. Both have been clearly weakened. Socialist is quite recent. Communist, it's a sort of historic, steady, slow decline. Now it's a very small party. The Greens, third party, they've been around for 30, 40 years as a major political force. They're more advanced politically than the British counterparts, where they are starting really to make gains in the UK. I think it's also a question of the electoral system. It's more difficult for the Greens here. So the Greens have been there. And then the newcomers, LFI, Unbowed France, France Insoumise of Jean-Luc Mélenchon. And I think you could say that overall there is convergence when need be, when they need, for instance, to go to a very risky election such as last year. They get together, they are able in a matter of days to come up with a program, a political program, so to agree in principle on policies, in principle, and I think in terms of what is to be done and opposing Macron and his policies, there's agreement. So at least you could say there's a base there. But of course, that's the sort of broad picture. When you look into certain matters, international affairs, the European Union, even you could argue the way you oppose, the method of opposing Macron when in opposition, then all the big disagreements and problems, arise. And there are different ways. I think to explain probably socialist, communists, it's pretty well known what they stand for, the Greens as well. But Mélenchon probably requires a little bit of explanation. He's a former socialist. Until 2008, he was very close, a great admirer of President Mitterrand. He was on the left wing of the Socialist Party, but I would say no more left wing than, say, someone like John McDonnell. I would even say less left wing than John McDonnell or Jeremy Corbyn in his time, because he was a follower of Mitterrand above all. He left the party because he decided, well, there's no future for social democracy in general, and starting in France, he launched already, I think, France Insoumise already is a second movement. First one was called the Parti Gauche, left party, which is very much centered around his own personality. Critics argue it's very autocratic, there's no internal democracy. And I think in a nutshell, his strategy, because let's talk in terms of strategy. So, of course, his politics is very much, you would say, a kind of very radical social democracy. Some would say radical left. I think it's in between. And his strategy is to say that, well, the system is absolutely collapsing. And I think to a large extent he's right. The system is no longer working. So we must destitute. Destitution is the key word he's been hammering for the past 2-3 years. We must destitute Macron and have a new presidential election. Because only the French key election, the presidential one, it's not the general election, the key election, it's the president. Because the president has so much power in France. And he wants it because his opponents, critics argue, of course, that's the only way for him to, possibly make it to the second round and possibly get elected. Without it, he can't get anywhere because his party remains, in all elections stuck at 9-10%. So it's not a major, a lot of it goes around the strategy of a new presidential election, and constantly, and that's why there is infighting and really bad blood on the left for a while, is that he alternates moments where he allies with, he's in an alliance with the other parties of the left, and other times, such as now, where he constantly belittles, criticizes, or even insults other left-wing parties. So it doesn't work well.
When you mentioned Mélenchon, perhaps in the UK, his British equivalent, at least most would say, would be Jeremy Corbyn. However, for me, it sounds more like George Galloway, someone who has very left-wing views. The Ukraine-Russia war, he's very sympathetic towards Putin, and then also when it comes to Gaza, he's very sympathetic towards the pro-Palestinian state issue. However, he has almost autocratic tendency, which also Galloway has. So how could you explain, for example, his success, albeit small, in France, compared to Galloway's success here, which is really meaningless here? He's not won a single seat since the general election, and he doesn't look like his party will win another seat. So what makes France different to the UK?
That's an interesting comparison. Mélenchon being the sort of French Galloway as opposed to being a French Corbyn. I tend to agree with that, particularly in terms of personality. more than politics in a way.
Okay.
Politics, probably Corbyn and him. It would be a mixture of the two for the politics, but personality definitely more of a Galloway than Corbyn. Corbyn is more careful, despite his numerous gaffes and mistakes. Corbyn tends to be, in my view, more cautious on certain issues than Mélenchon. For instance, when this ongoing story which led to his being expelled from the Labour Party on anti-Semitism, Mélenchon was, to my knowledge, as far as I know, the only European leader on the left to say publicly that Corbyn had caved in, that it was a big mistake, that he had caved into the Jewish lobby, using expressions like this. I think no left-wingers anywhere would have gone as far as that. So that shows something, a bit of a dark side, Galloway style, and autocracy is very well documented in France. Of course, there are people in the party, there are decisions, but he calls the shots, all the shots. There isn't a single major decision in terms of strategy or policy. If he opposes something or if he decides something, no one will go against it. So that's not a sign, if you like, of a sort of a democratic movement. But, and this is where probably it gets closer to Corbyn rather than Galloway, and I can't explain why Galloway probably was not more successful. Probably had to do with his personality. People didn't trust him. And probably because Galloway made some inroads and a few gains, seats, starting with seats gained by himself, were made on the back of single issues. The war in Iraq, Gaza. Whereas Mélenchon was more to his game than single issues. And addressing one single constituency, although his critics in France say that he's very much targeting the young. Not all kind of young educated, young going to uni, of course, who are very mobilized on, for instance, at the moment on Gaza, and ethnic minorities. So that's really at the moment. But Mélenchon, at the same time, wants to appeal to other segments of. That's why he's more of a Jeremy Corbyn in the end. Mélenchon was never in power on his own, and he never ran a major party, so I can't say what he would do, but there are issues on the left when you don't permit real democracy, when all the decisions are top-down, when some of your views are clearly controversial. And I think controversy starts as soon as you start discussing international affairs. Not simply Gaza and Israel, which are, as you know, very sensitive issues all over the world in any country, but on Ukraine, he's not clear about that. He keeps making statements which are very dubious at this time, finding excuses to Putin and saying, well, Ukraine should stop that war, they can't win it. He says things like that today. So he's not clear about certain issues. He's defended China against Tibet. He's defended a lot of dictatorships. Syria, El-Assad, Syria, finding excuses also to El-Assad for his crimes. That's really bizarre. But of course, as you know, he gets away with it because you don't win or lose a general election at home because of international affairs, unless the issue becomes so concerns people directly. You know, as long as there's not a war here in the UK or Britain, they can say a lot of terrible things, and that's what happens. You know, a lot of people I see in France, left-wing intellectuals, students, people I know who are absolutely decent people, keep supporting him. And when you sort of discuss those issues, they are very embarrassed. But they say, well, you know, that's not exactly what he meant. And anyway, we should probably turn a blind eye to it because he's so good on other issues. So that's the rationale.
I see. Okay. And so when it comes to, obviously you mentioned the 2027 presidential election that will be happening. What do you think the left have as a chance? So, for example, I hear that the Socialist Party is starting to make a comeback, a slow one, but a sure one. During the time when the LFI, France Insoumise were also making a surge in the polls, at least for the assembly elections. What happened? Do you think this comeback from the Socialist Party is going to be permanent, or do you believe that there is another chance for a Mélenchon to come up and take the race to Le Pen?
That's really a key question for the future of the left to start with, but also for, I suppose, the future of French democracy, because French democracy isn't doing too well at the moment. It is important that we get a left that doesn't get to that bottom of 30% or so, which is absolutely too little to hope for the left to win. And that's partly answering your question, can the left win in 2027? It's unlikely, I'm afraid. And I'm speaking here, of course, as a political scientist. There's a lack of support. How can you transform those 30% into 50% plus one vote in a second round of a presidential election? Because that's what you need. In a second round of a presidential election, you have two candidates only. The two ranking first and second in the first round go into the second round. And then you need to convince half of the population to support you. And at the moment, it could only happen with a kind of candidate which is not tainted by all the scandals, by all the controversies, and I think that would seem to exclude, in my opinion, Mélenchon. Mélenchon can't. Should he qualify in the second round, which he failed to do in his last 3 attempts, he's done it already 3 attempts, he would be emphatically defeated by either a right-wing candidate or by the far right, which, can you imagine in France, the second round of a presidential election, the candidate of the left, of the United, being defeated by the far right? How disastrous it would be. It would be. And I think people on the left do not think about this prospect enough, because it's almost a certainty, because the far right, whatever you might think of it, at the moment, the far right of Marine Le Pen is not seen, regarded by French voters as the same party as the party of Marine Le Pen's father, Jean-Marie Le Pen. You know, people, how otherwise would you explain that this party is largely ahead in the polls, has won all the recent elections largely, and is now on 33% in the opinion polls. The second bloc, the left, is on 19%.
But do you think that's mainly attributable to the characters, or the fact that they are taking certain policies, certain issues to the public? So they're very strong on anti-immigration, but you can't really, can you have a left party that is also strong on anti-immigration? I mean, these are quite difficult topics for the left to adopt, not only in France but in the UK.
Yes, I think those issues crop up everywhere, the same everywhere. I think the answer to your question is both. I think it's a question of finding a suitable candidate. The French presidential election is a more personalized election than the general election here. We know we're kind of voting for a future prime minister. The prime minister will be coming from the majority party, so either Labour or Conservative so far. So it is to some extent personalized, but the logic of the election is more parliamentary here in the UK. You first elect a majority in the House. In France, that French presidential election that was set up, imagined by Charles de Gaulle in 1958, is really vote for a person. That's really, and I think it got to the point the past years or so that before you were voting for a person, but a person supported by a main party and a program. And it seems that now the party, because French parties are in such a bad state, they're very weak, very few members. Situation is worse than in the UK, believe me. The program, no one talks about programs much nowadays. A few big ideas are floated, and that's all. it's the personality.
Right.
So that explains also why Mélenchon does much better than his left-wing opponents in the last two previous elections, because he's a very, very good debater on TV. He's a very good guy. He's very good at leading campaigns. He uses modern technologies. He's surrounded by young people. He's very good at that. And that explains why is that. So problem is the personality. Policies also is the other issue. It seems that the winning formula is they're a bit stuck like 1970s, 80s. Let's write up a program which is long, exhaustive. We should really deal with all matters. First of all, the left is not really united, as I said earlier. So people will not entirely trust this kind of very exhaustive program. The same type as Corbyn's program in 2019. It's a very long program. People do not pay attention or digest it nowadays. And it seems that yes, on a number of issues, and I'm not, the left keeps doing what it does and should do, which is fight for more social justice, equality, fairness, in support of public services, etc. And it does it in France. But I think, yes, there are certain issues which they refuse to engage. And you mentioned some. And of course, talking about immigration, national identity, multiculturalism, which is a word in France, which is, in the French Republican context, which is very easy to deal with, which is difficult to deal with, and they refuse to engage it. Most of the time they say this is right-wing stuff, we're not going to go down that.
Right.
I think it's a mistake, because there should be a kind of progressive narrative on those issues, because if you don't oppose a progressive narrative on those issues, then you will let the right, Macron, starting from Macron to the far right, develop it together with the media. The media in France now, there's a lot of private channels which are more and more shifting to the right, and whose airtime is entirely devoted to Islam, multiculturalism, immigration.
Just touching up on that. I remember a few years back, the name of the far right was Eric Zemmour, and what do you think has happened to a figure like that? Because Le Pen seems to have made a comeback since then. But I remember he was on the front screens of every phone, and he was making really big strides in the far right movement. So is it that Islam itself has taken a back seat in terms of the most pertinent issues, or do you think it's just new characters like Bardella who came into Le Pen's camp and revived the party?
Well, next time you're in France, if you're in a hotel, you have all those channels, French channels, just tune in and you'll see that that issue of Islam and immigration hasn't gone. It's still there. It's just that it's been accommodated by more centrist parties, starting with Macron, that there's a kind of... it's become mainstream, unfortunately, and that's quite a scary thing, is that the views which were deemed extreme in French politics 20, 30 years ago are now part of the mainstream, not because Le Pen pushed them very hard, but because Macron and his conservative allies have largely adopted them. So that's the number one point to make. As for Zemmour is an interesting example, because Zemmour was some kind of pundit. It's not even a true journalist, a pundit, who was for years on TV. There's a French channel called, a private French channel, 24-hour news channel called CNews. And CNews is owned by a billionaire called Bolloré, Vincent Bolloré, one of the biggest French fortunes, who has decided on this very right-wing agenda. So he had promoted Zemmour, giving him lots of airtime, where unchallenged he could talk on and on about the so-called incompatibility between Islam and French Republican values, and so on and so forth. So that made him quite big. He started to believe in his own chances, ran, and ran a very, very extreme campaign on those issues. But Le Pen is shrewd politically. She's quite a seasoned politician now. She's no longer very naive. She saw it coming. She kept firm. I'm not saying that Le Pen is now a mainstream right-winger. She's not. But she let Zemmour occupy that position to her right on those issues, concentrating on bread and butter issues, and let him develop on those issues, doing the dirty work for her in a way, and I think in the end, Zemmour didn't do well, and Le Pen did well. And it shows one thing, it shows that if allegedly, that needs to be sort of double-checked and investigated, but if allegedly the voters are shifted to the right in France and elsewhere, at least they don't want extremists like Zemmour. It was too much. Zemmour got to a point where his rhetoric was absolutely too much, and people found it was distasteful, it was absolutely dangerous. So the people who voted for Zemmour, it's interesting. It's a kind of it's a rather wealthy, very right-wing conservative. It's not the kind of white working class from the north in former industrialized bastion, of the north, which vote for Le Pen. It's a kind, and those people want Le Pen to keep concentrating on a more social agenda. The people who voted for Zemmour were that, wealthy but very right-wing, and of course obsessed with those identity politics.
Right.
That's why he didn't do well. So at least this is mildly reassuring. The French are not ready for a sort of the kind of a far-right guide which probably Jean-Marie Le Pen was in the 1970s. He was really going back there, you see.
So you don't believe those guys who, as you said, who were in the former industrial towns, have that much of a strong opposition to Islam or Muslims? I know in Paris is a big issue, but outside of Paris, you don't believe that's their main concern?
I think there's not one type of far-right voter, and I would say even people who are racist, right-wing voter in general. But let's say the far-right, people vote for Le Pen. I think there's now a kind of some very good political science work carried out on this issue, with lots of qualitative research, interviews being carried out with people voting for the FN. And then you realize when you read those books and articles that the main motivations for voting for the far right is most of these people are struggling economically. They are really, a lot of them, if they're not working class, there's a type of low middle class who feels that they could suddenly be downgraded. They could lose their job, they could lose their house. They're not certain they could pay for their kids' education, and they're not certain that their kids would have a better future than theirs. So it's a lot of fear. Secondly, resentment. This idea, which is of course wrong, that for instance migrants or ethnic minorities get a better treatment than them. They get more subsidies, they get more support from the state. So there's a lot of resentment. Thirdly, there's a complete distrust with regard to mainstream politicians, the left and right. That's why the left they don't even hear the left anymore. They're working class, but they don't hear the left. The left is absolutely seen. Macron is hated, but the left is, I wouldn't say hated, they haven't been in office, they scorn. They just don't, the left, they promise to raise minimum wage, but how can they do that? There's no money available. You see, this sort of thing. So, you see, that's another reason. And then when you put all that together, the fear, the resentment, the fear of downgrading, the resentment, and then for people who, will live, for instance, in certain areas where you have, where it is multicultural, they will think that, the migrants or the ethnic minorities are going to, for instance, get a better deal with me. All the if, for instance, I can't get, I'm on the waiting list for the NHS, the French NHS, because there are too many migrants.
Right.
City centers. There used to be, cafes run by French people. Now it's the Arabic guy who was having selling halal food. And this is where racism crops up finally. It's a mixture of social downgrading, resentment, fear, and you need to look for a scapegoat. And the scapegoat is easy to find because it is served to them day in, day out by right-wing media and those politicians, notably on the far right. The role of the far right is always to agitate. This is how it works. So you see, it's a little bit, of course there's racism, no doubt, but it's a bit more complex than simply saying, well, those guys, when they wake up in the morning, they're like Ku Klux Klan guys. No, Ku Klux Klan guys are people who are, absolutely ideologically motivated by racism and feeling a sense of racial superiority. I don't think it's that deep. It's not that. It's a sort of population. I'm talking about white working class in the north of France. Those regions were bastions of the left until 10, 15 years ago. But real bastions. MPs would be elected with, incredible majorities. A bit story similar to the Red Wars in the UK. Incredible majorities, and the situation now. It's the same situation. I think there's a strong parallel to be made between Red Walls voting Brexit against their interests, I suppose, but they still voted Brexit, believing first in Jackson. Now they seem to probably believe in reform. They'll get disappointed again, but you need to look for a scapegoat because you are adamant that the mainstream political class, left and right, are beyond the pale. They've disappointed you. They won't do anything for you.
So just to probably finalise a bit, the budget that's been passed through Parliament, I mean, various prime ministers have tried, failed. What do you think the public think of this? What do you think their opinions are of this? Do they want the budget to go through because of the exorbitant amount of debt that the country is running through right now? Or do you think they are currently agreeing with the parties, both left, right, or even centre, who are refusing to go in for an agreement? So I understand especially from the far left, they want wealth taxes and they won't budge on that. Do you think the public are on their side? They have the public sentiment? Or do you think they're in their own bubble?
Well, I think so far they've been on their own bubble. Bayrou fell because of that. Bayrou thought that he could go to Parliament or go on TV and say, well, look, the amount of the debt is so incredibly high that we're really taking incredible risk for the economy. I'm not denying that being deeply in debt and the debt growing on and on is a minor issue. It's a serious issue, and something should be done about it. But it remains to be seen how you do it, the debt reduction. And I think this is where there's a strong political discussion in France going on, where on that you have a clear left-right divide again. So we're going back to traditional game. I said now the game is completely fragmented, 3-4 blocks. It's a mess. On that issue, it's clearly left and right. So on the left, first of all, there is this argument saying, well, you can't compare. That's what Bayrou did. Bayrou compared the French debt, public debt, to private debt. The debt you may have as a person in a household. When a firm, a business, or a private person, is deeply in debt, of course, at some point you go bust. So that's serious. The French state can't go bust in the same way. Even if deeply in debt, the French state and France as an economy is very wealthy. It has resources. So that's why the markets are still lending money to France at a good rate. That may change if France doesn't do anything, and that's part of the thing. It's the timing. Will they do something, and how? So that confirms my point, the fact that markets, despite France being deeply in debt, keeps giving, lending the money. So that's the first argument made on the left. Secondly, says, well, we should do something about the debt, but it should be the very wealthy who should really bear, the sort of largely pay for it, because there's been a general impoverishment of working people in France. That's true. Minimum wage is very low in France, lower than here. Incredibly, like for like, incomes also are lower than here. France has become a very unequal society, with incredible wealth on top, the top 5, top 1% even, and then middle class is doing okay but struggling, and then impoverishment of the rest of the population, and that's why you have the reservoir of far-right votes is there. People sees no future. They work so hard, and then they just can't pay the bills at the end of the month, and that's absolutely terrible. So that's the argument of the left. It should be so that the Zucman tax on the very wealthy, just the 1% of the population, the most wealthy, it's about over 1,000 families in France.
Right.
By Zucman, the economist says that by taxing 2% of their wealth, you could raise 20 billion euros. Beirut proposed a debt reduction of 44 billion. So 44 minus 20, you already deals with half of the debt. On the right, it is the usual right-wing thing, which is they will not do that. Of course, they will say from Macron to Le Pen, they will say we're living beyond our means. We need to stretch need to tighten our belt, and we need to cut on spending, public services. But that's one of the reasons we're heading toward, a major political catastrophe, possibly in the future, because the public, and here I'm talking about people, not necessarily the left-wing voters, people in general, are fed up of, paying more taxes when they know very well that there are people who are doing extremely well and pay very little tax, relatively to their overall wealth. Right. So that's really the discussion in France. I think that's a very interesting one. And the enigma to me is, why can't the French left capitalize more on this argument, which seems to me popular, on taxing the very wealthy, the 1%. Yeah. Why can't they? Why can't they embarrass Le Pen more? Le Pen is really embarrassed with this discussion because she has to keep on board that white working class electorate, which want that kind of measures. They would be happy about that.
Yeah.
But Le Pen has adapted rhetoric over the years to that electorate. Sounding sometimes, that's why it's always a bit annoying, irritating, the British media, and particularly where some interviewing me saying, well, Le Pen is a socialist now.
Yeah, I've seen that.
And I always say, read the small print.
Yeah.
It's about, she may sound, if you're not too, you don't pay too much attention, roughly speaking, she might sound a bit of a social democrat, but read the small print and see how she votes with our parliamentary group. Mm-hmm. She would never vote to raise the minimum wage. She would never vote for, even on pension. Another example, the left has been fighting, Macron has pushed the retirement age from 62 to 64. There's been lots of demonstrations, lots of opposition to it across the political spectrum, left and right, both. People are unhappy about that. French may accept not to earn too much while they work, but they don't want to work until they drop dead. This is something very cultural, very entrenched. There should be a time where you stop working in your life when you're not too old, because otherwise, how can you enjoy your retirement if you work until your 70s and you're ill?
Yeah.
I think that's a very good point. So that's why it's not popular. The left is proposing going back to 62. Mélenchon and others even 60. I don't think he will get that, but even 62. Le Pen officially is also in favor of that.
Right.
But whenever the topic gets, on the table and is being discussed, I think she hides and she vanishes from view. She never takes part with the party to any demos, against Macron's reform. She wouldn't be welcome anyway in those demos with the unions and the left. But, she could publicly do a little bit more. She doesn't. So there's a kind of, with Le Pen on those issues, there's a rhetoric, and what she does is she talks the talks, but she doesn't walk the walk. Yeah.
Okay. And as a final question, I'd just like to ask, who do you believe are the rising stars, perhaps of the French far right, or maybe even the moderate left, and all across the spectrum? I know there's Bardella, there's Mélenchon's not a rising star; he's already risen. But who else among these categories would you say, oh, okay, in the next presidential election they've got a good shot?
Yeah, that's a good question, because in a personalized elections, as I said earlier, such as the presidential election, it would be reassuring for your own political family to think that we've got a rising star, someone who is a good communicator, who's good on policy, who is competent overall, and seen as such by the public. And I'm afraid there's no rising star, really. I think it would be a big blow if Le Pen can't run because of her conviction, if it's confirmed next spring. Because Bardella is young, Bardella may be very popular on TikTok with youngsters, but the French would think twice before, putting their vote in the ballot box for such a young man, untested, who, when discussing issues on TV, for instance, is not very good. I'm setting aside, his policies and politics, but he's not good. He's not good at all. Le Pen has become good over the years. She's a seasoned politician, so that would be a big blow. So there's Bardella coming up.
Could you not say that in terms of just touching up on the age argument, that the dice was rolled for Macron when, he was relatively young, no?
He was 39 when he was elected, which was extraordinary in the French context. There was never before such a young, particularly president. It's the main political job in France. Politicians were, if you think, it took 3 attempts for Mitterrand in his late 60s to be elected. It took 3 attempts for Chirac in his late 60s to be elected. Mélenchon, that would be 4th attempt. Le Pen, that would be a 4th attempt. When you finally get there, you're already, even older than me. So imagine. But Macron was really a sort of an exemption. Now, when you turn the centrist bloc, centre-right, I think there's no one really coming up there. There's probably the best figure, the best would be the first Prime Minister of Macron, Edouard Philippe. I don't know if you remember this guy.
Yeah.
He was for 2 or 3 years Prime Minister just after 2017. He's the mayor of Le Havre. Comes across as solid, serious, but nothing exciting. But that could be enough, if he faces, the far right in the second round. He might just scrap it and win it. Now on the left, I'm not going to say Mélenchon is a newcomer. He will be 76 in 26. He's been around for Mélenchon. It's love and hate. There's a core of the electorate, 7 to 10% at best, who seem to like him very much. But the rest, not. He's very controversial, very detested by the rest, including by some segments of the left. That's why I don't think he's someone who can carry the left to victory. Apart from that, I don't see there. I'm gonna mention 2 other guys on the left for the listeners, to make their opinion about. One is close to the Socialist Party, although not a member of the Socialist Party. Is the leader of a small party called Place Publique, Public Square. That's how it translates into English. his name is Raphael Glucksmann. He led the socialist list at the last EU election and did well. The list of the socialists came first of all left-wing list. Is pro-European. He's a kind of Anglo-American style liberal. He's very, very active on Ukraine, in support of Ukraine. He also says the right thing on Gaza in support of Palestinians, of course, less than Mélenchon. But of course, the more radical left doesn't like him, says he's too, wishy-washy, too liberal, too moderate. And there's a final guy who, if I can remember his name, but that's always a problem when you want to quote people and mention them. François Ruffin, here we go. François Ruffin, a very interesting François Ruffin, a journalist for a long time, who was elected to Parliament in 2017 as an LFI MP, but never got along well with Mélenchon, because Ruffin is interesting. He shot, as a journalist, a few documentaries which were very successful, political documentaries, where he looks into the situation of that kind of electorate, because he comes from the region of Amiens in the north of France, very working class region, a region that has shifted to the National Rally and the far right. He is himself elected in a constituency where in national elections people vote, the majority votes for Le Pen, for National Rally. But he manages, because of his personality, he manages to win in that far right constituency. So it's a very interesting case. And unlike Mélenchon and LFI, who recently have concentrated very much on the Gaza-Palestine issue, on identity politics, he's very much on the socio-economic side, and saying, well, we can't give up on that white working class electorate, who is now either abstaining or voting for the far right.
So what party was he?
So he's now, he left LFI together with four other MPs a year ago.
Okay.
There was a kind of, they were expelled because Mélenchon didn't like them, didn't tolerate them anymore, because they were critical of the party line. And they all, and himself, are part of the Green Party now.
I see.
So probably the two names to watch. There will be a primary election on the left to appoint, to designate one single candidate, but we know already that Mélenchon will not take part in that primary election. Mélenchon, regardless of what the other parties of the left would do, will go and will be a candidate.
Oh, he will be?
Yes.
He will be a candidate?
Yes, so whatever. So there will be probably one unity candidate for the left, so Green, Socialist and Communist, very probably, especially if the far right is very, very high in the polls. That would be a kind of reflex, anti-far right reflex. Mélenchon, regardless of that, will go, so we'll split the vote. And so,
that's interesting.
Going back to your initial question, you may remember, can the left win? Then, there's no particular reason to be strongly optimistic, because the left-wing vote, which is very low, will be split again.